Hello, my name is Will. This is a welcome to a page which contains talks around my experiences of 55 years of inhabiting this body. It's been a life of joy, happiness, sadness, grief, beauty, wonder, travel, and then brokenness and emptiness and retreating into a very simple way of living, an empty way of living, a life that might be described at certain times to have been terrible, living out of a terrible set of circumstances. And then a seed planted in the midst of that at the age of 37 of becoming open-minded, not out of virtue, but out of the desolation of one's own circumstances, creating a degree of willingness sufficient to be open-minded to this simple nugget of an idea, and that is, I can't fix this on my own. Because up until then, with the programs and patterns for the first half of life of my conditioning, my family, my schooling and my culture, and the absence of any discernible spiritual teaching or wisdom teaching other than that of listening to one's own inner self and finding out by one's own direct answers whether experiences were healthy or not. Many weren't, and both unhealthy experiences and healthy teachers have both been awesome teachers. Everything works for the good in the end. So I've moved through periods of substance use, substance misuse, and being used by substances. So there's that narrative, and all of that was spiritual seeking. I grew up in a house of, at a certain point, unresolved grief. So there's an empty chair, and the empty chair embodied the absence of a parent, my mother, who had died on any given day. I came in from school, and there was not that degree of feminine energy that, up until that point, this young boy found super helpful, and that would have involved later development that thereafter was absent. I'm not unique in that experience. It's not something 40 years later people need to apologise to me for, that I grew up with a set of circumstances. We do often as children, we grow up moving through experiences that aren't appropriate, or that we're not at an age that we're equipped for. I'm not unique in that. Many of us know those things. So out of that very youthful sense of emptiness and brokenness, a hole appeared, an emptiness appeared that was fundamentally good, but in the environment and the situation and the circumstances in which I grew up, there was no way to intuit that goodness. It just felt like emptiness and brokenness and pain. And so there was another 20 years of pouring stuff into that void, and the void was already fertile, but in putting things into it, whatever it was, wherever it was that I sensed that I had newly found happiness, whatever it was, whatever object this subject looked out into the world and thought, yes, this time this is it, worked. Every one of them worked, whether it was relationships, whether it was new peer groups, whether it was new identities with which to identify: musician, dancer, writer, actor, student, factory worker, broken person, drug addict. These were all labels that I happily invested in as my latest identity or my latest source of happiness. And they all seemed to work for a little while, and all the vehicles that took me into them, whether that was people, places, things, again, substances, overeating, undereating, overachieving, underachieving, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or antidepressants, labels, mental health diagnoses, if all these things made sense briefly. And all of them I invested in with a vigour that I'd never found before, or perhaps I'd tried the last time. But in each of them, one finds out that this current version of oneself, we've all heard this phrase, the best version of myself I've ever been. Every best version of myself that I'd ever been worked until the realization that it wasn't working anymore rose as a simple thought that said exactly the same thing, the same tape played. This isn't working. And by then it was always too late. And the confounding feature was to continue to be that character, even though there was an awareness and a burgeoning aliveness that it wasn't working. Yet one continued to make it work without there being anything else with which to try, until something new came along. One's descent through different substances and the gifts that they gave, and even those so-called cultural hard drugs, were survival mechanisms and defense mechanisms at the time, protecting I don't know what, protecting the fact that freedom lay the other side of the invisible thing that I thought I needed to protect. Yet once all of that radically and fundamentally collapsed, and there was just a precipice of emptiness, and the collapse of the programs nudged me gently off into that void. That void was the end of all of the self programs. It wasn't that I found a better self that I could finally be. It was in the absence, the realization of the absence of the self, or a sense of self that needed to fix it on my own resources. On that flimsy reed, wonderfully effective way of being in the world finally emerged. It was the discovery that the happiness that I'd been seeking had been in my pocket all along. Yet in searching for it, I'd overlooked the very pocket that it was in. And if you knew me along the way, as I searched, and I was part of your peer group or our circles of being overlapped, you would have seen me as someone who was seemed to be quite forgetful, but the forgetfulness was just living out of the mental narrative of modern life and trying to find happiness by thinking my way through environments, situations, people, places, things, and roles. Point being, welcome to more of this and more exploration of more of what's been alluded to here. Hopefully some of this made sense. It seems to have made sense from this point in terms of trying to record something to welcome you to this. May you find here what you had in your pocket all along, because that's where it is. Maybe some of this might help point to that. If not, move on. But if it does, it's all to the good. Peace.